Okay, so we're going to start with the macroeconomy. Very quickly, can someone remind me what's the difference in micro and macro?
Micro is when there's government intervention.
Micro is when there's government intervention. No.
Micro is like of private individual firms like and macro is more like the country and all.
Micro is when we study the economic behavior of individuals, firms, and markets, right? Of individual like industries. Even if I'm talking about the entire oil industry, it's massive, but it's still going to be microeconomics. Guys, it has to do with scale. Micro means small, macro means big, right? So smaller level economic agents. And macro is when we talk about the whole economy, right? So when we come to macroeconomics, we start dealing in aggregates, correct? What does aggregate mean, Ashna?
Average, I guess.
No.
Oh, is it like combined of all of the stuff?
Correct. Total, right? It means total, addition, sum, right? When we talk about our entire economy, we're not suddenly taking an average. We're talking about our entire economy. We're adding up everybody's income or everybody's employment level. Yeah. So just a little quick revision of macro. All right. Now we come to our first topic, which is economic growth, economic development, and sustainability. Today, I'll just try to cover as much of economic growth as I can. What is economic growth? What is economic growth? It's a macroeconomic aim of the government.
Increase in output over a period of time.
Correct. I'm sure you can define it even better. How do we measure that increase in output?
GDP.
Correct. So can we say it's an increase in an economy's output in terms of GDP, right? So it's usually seen as an increase in real GDP over a period of time. Yeah. When we talk about economic growth, it's a percentage, right? We don't see it as a number. We don't see like, oh, 5 billion. We see it as a rate. So what is it the rate of? It's the rate is the annual percentage change in output. Does that make sense? It's not just the size of my economy. It's this change in the size of my economy, right? The growth that has occurred. It's the annual percentage change in output.
So it's basically the change in GDP, right?
Yes, it's usually measured as the percentage change in real GDP. Why do we want economies to grow? GDP per head also it could be. Why do we want our economies to grow? No idea? All of economics is centered around the idea that they should grow.
To improve standards of living.
Right? To improve standards of living. That's the ultimate aim. But what has happened is we have only measured it in material terms of real GDP per head, right? So we've not ended up with a very accurate idea of standard of living. But ultimately, that is the idea, right? That we want to have an increase in people's standard of living, the welfare of the people. Okay. So let us define economic growth properly. In the short run, it is an increase in the country's output. Now going back to ASPPC, does anybody remember what long run economic growth is?
Improvement in quantity and quality of resources.
Yes. So improvement in the country's productive potential. In the long run, it is an increase in a country's productive potential. Remember, actual economic growth versus potential economic growth. Both are types of economic growth, right? So both of them need to be spoken about whenever we talk about economic growth. And so we differentiate between economic growth and economic development. First, we used to confuse the two. We were like, okay, when GDP increases, people's standard of living increases. But as economics has advanced as a study, as people have realized that, hey, this is not translating to better quality of life necessarily, we started trying to measure economic development. Development is a more holistic idea, right? Development has to do with an increase in the welfare and quality of life. So of course, these two are interlinked, right? You need to have better incomes to be able to afford more goods and services, to have a higher quality of life, right? But it also involves better education, higher standards of health and nutrition, safety, no relative poverty, a clean environment, equal opportunity, individual freedom, and a rich cultural life. Yes? So one of the pioneering economists when it comes to development economics actually is Amartya Sen, an Indian, I think the most famous Indian economist that is, okay, at least currently. And so you can look into some of his work if you're going to attempt answers on economic development and growth. So I believe Nianika and Dhruvi, your teachers explained to you how you're going to have to select a few topics and prepare those for structured, right? So that's how it works generally for boards as well. We cover all our portion because we need to know it for MCQs and case studies. But when we practice structured, we pick 4 or 5 topics that we like and we practice those. There's roughly 15 topics in our book. So we pick like 5 and stick to those, thoroughly practice those and answer those in the paper. So if you're going to do that, you should be able to quote some economists, give some real world examples, okay? So Amartya Sen was a famous development economist. And he emphasized the importance of individual freedom. The idea comes down to the fact that we should be able to choose. Once you have that option to choose, that's when you can truly say that, you're living in a developed economy. Your quality of life is improved once you have the ability to choose. They've reiterated this a lot, but I think we're good with this, right? I don't need to expand that. Growth is linked higher income can improve the quality of life, but education, nutrition, choice are also important. All right. Next, we come to the concept of sustainability.
Can you repeat? Growth is like you've written growth is linked, but to what is linked?
To economic development. Economic growth is linked to economic development because when there is a high income, that's when we're going to have a high quality of life. Yeah. Next, we have the idea of sustainability. Did any of you take EVM? No? It's a nice scoring subject. You should have taken it. It was the easiest subject to study. Okay, but do we still know what the idea of sustainability means? Maybe on Instagram now we see a lot of sustainable fashion. What does that mean? Ashna, any idea?
I think resources that can be used again and again that don't deplete are sustainable.
Yeah. So it's not the idea that those resources can't deplete. Sustainability is the idea of using resources in such a way in a manner where current consumption doesn't sacrifice future consumption, right? Ensuring the needs of future generations as well. So now talking about economic, that's why sustainable fashion is when we're rebuying clothes, right? Or we're mending our clothes and using them, or we're thrifting. The idea is that you're reusing those resources. Those resources in themselves are not renewable, right? They're not renewable resources, but it's still sustainable to do so. So in economics, we talk about sustainable development, which is just development with the idea of sustainability at its core, right? So development that ensures that the needs of the present generation can be met without compromising the well-being of future generations. This concept of sustainability is one that we should know just in life. Hi,
Yes. Sorry, I called late. My internet wasn't working.
all right. So we learned what economic growth is, we learned what economic development is, and now we're learning what sustainability is. Economic growth is when there's an increase in real GDP, right? It's a very material thing where the country's output increases. Economic development is more than that. It's when your country's output increases, but also when the person's quality of life actually improves, right? And now we're talking about sustainable development. Development that ensures that the needs of the present generation can be met without compromising the well-being of future generations. Ashna, why do you keep turning off your camera?
My Wi-Fi it keeps lagging in the middle.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So can we say that economic growth and sustainability are actually quite conflicting? Do you think when we have economic growth, when I keep trying to improve my output level, am I not depleting my resources? In order to increase my output, I'm always going to be depleting my resources. So growth tends to conflict sustainability. So that's why we need to use renewable materials, recycle, yeah, all those ideas.
Can you explain this point?
The idea that growth conflicts sustainability.
Yeah.
So if I'm increasing my output, I'm producing more, right? When I'm producing more goods and services, I'm taking in more inputs as well. And all those inputs tend to be things like non-renewable resources, right? All the plastics we use, all the metals we use, all the fuel we use is very non-renewable. And so we end up depleting all of our natural resources. So that's the problem, that we want to have growth, but growth conflicts sustainability. But sustainability is what allows for development. Like sustainability ensures that quality of life is not being compromised. If we're not being sustainable, we're often spoiling the environment in which we live. Economic growth often has pollution as a side effect, right? And pollution is not sustainable. Therefore, we should use renewable, we should recycle new technologies. New technologies, in fact, play a big role. They not only change the access to resources we have, but they also change our way of being able to use them. So there's less wastage. So again, it comes down to quality of life. So it's a more development thing. That's why it's sustainable development, not sustainable growth, but in the future as well. Make sense?
Because like you're talking about sustainability, right? Because depletion doesn't happen. That's why quality of life is better in the future as well. Correct.
Yes, perfect. So then we need to keep 3 forms of objectives in our mind. Okay. First is, of course, economic objectives. We're still going to continue production, right? We're not giving up on production. Economic objectives requires a better use of resources. Growth should ensure that sufficient resources are available to invest in human capital as well as physical capital, right? So what does this mean? Remember, we studied the market failure of short-termism in 10th grade? That is not sustainable, right? Where you're only producing consumer goods and not producing enough capital goods.
I don't know about it.
Okay, short-termism is a form of market failure. Dhruvi, do you remember?
No, I don't think we have done.
Okay. So short-termism is just where there's not enough investment in capital goods. Okay. So if we keep producing consumer goods and we don't produce enough capital goods, will 10 years down the line, will we still be able to produce economically? No, right? We won't have any capital left to produce with. So that's why when we talk about economic objectives in relation to sustainability, the idea comes that you need to invest in your physical and human capital. We mustn't have used the word short-termism for it, but I'm sure in the mark scheme, when we discuss disadvantages of the market economic sector, one of the points was always that there's not enough investment in capital goods. It's because they're focused on short-term profits. Consumer goods provide you with short-term profits. Capital goods provide you with long-term benefits. Next is social objectives. So this has to do with the distribution of the economic growth. What does that mean?
Maybe income equality.
Perfect. A sustainable approach involves an education system that gives girls the same opportunities as boys, is serious about reducing fertility rates, controlling the spread of HIV and AIDS, and providing for the elderly, right? It's helping girls, it's affecting single women, it's affecting, when they say AIDS, I believe the minority community they're referring to is the LGBTQ, and providing for the elderly, right? It's helping all communities, all types of people. Inequality doesn't have to mean only income inequality, gender-based equality, age, right? Sexual orientation. And then environmental objectives, which is, of course, what we think of first when we do actually end up thinking about sustainability. What are the environmental objectives? responsible use of natural resources.
Reusing.
Is everyone fully clear with it? Do we understand the difference in the new classical framework and the Keynesian framework?
Can we revise it?
Can we revise?
Yeah. I feel like they just never taught it at school. Here. What is aggregate demand? AD plus equals to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Yes? Aggregate demand is downward sloping. This much we know. Why do we have shifts of the curve? Since aggregate demand is influenced by all these different factors will shift my demand curve. Yes? This is very, very, very important. The place where we end up missing out on a lot of marks is only focusing on consumption from households. We have to talk about investment, about government investment, about exports and imports as well. Yeah? So consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. We come to aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is differentiated into two parts: short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is very simply the total output that's created, right? All economic schools of thought agree on short-run aggregate supply. It's going to be an upward sloping normal curve. Yes? It's a normal upward sloping curve. But the problem comes in, okay, shifts of the SRAS is also simple. It's basically shifts in your cost of production, right? When my cost of production increases, it'll shift to the left because of taxes, subsidies, supply shocks. What are supply shocks? Can we say the pandemic was a supply shock? Lockdown completely disrupted our supply chain. Yeah. Or very simply, your changes in factor prices.
Listen,
Now
is
we
it
come to-
okay for some time if I turn off my video? Because you're really lagging for me, I can't hear.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Now we come to LRAS, and this is where there is differentiation between what different schools of thought think. Okay. Do we have any idea? Monetarist or New Classical is one school of thought, and Keynesian is one school of thought. Can anybody tell me any distinction point? No? So, okay. So do we remember Adam Smith? The way I think to make it easier to remember, what was Adam Smith's idea? That everything always comes back to equilibrium, right? Our demand and supply model. Invisible hand, everything comes back to equilibrium. So what is the idea of New Classical model? That everything comes back to equilibrium. Okay? That's just how much in depth we need to know it. We don't need to go further. So New Classical is that everything comes back to equilibrium. Also called monetarist, mainly supported by this one economist called Milton Friedman. Yeah. Recent, I believe he died in like 2005. Biggest influence on economics ever. Our second school of thought is Keynesian. Keynesian we're more familiar with. Keynesian is John Maynard Keynes. He's the one who basically made fiscal policy popular in our entire world. Okay, before that, there was nothing called fiscal policy. Okay, so economy always comes back to equilibrium, Adam Smith. So Milton Friedman believed in something called the full employment level. Okay, these are AS notes, but we will in more depth study actually that there's something called the full employment level. Okay, it's called the natural rate of unemployment. Basically, he said that there's always going to be a certain level of unemployment, but that's it. There's still going to be a certain level that we can aspire to. That our economy, whatever happens, will always come back to. Like this is a potential output, and our economy will always come back to its potential output. And that's why we have a simply upward sloping straight line LRAS. If there is only one potential output that is correct, if there's only one real GDP point that is correct, it's going to cut my x-axis only at one point. So that's why I have an upward sloping LRAS. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. Now Keynes, how I like for classical, I told you the way to remember it is Adam Smith and equilibrium. Keynes, it's one of my favorite quotes in economics. In the long run, we're all dead. His whole problem was that all of these classical analysis takes place so in the long run that analysis says that in the long run we'll come back to equilibrium. But Keynes said, who cares about the long run? 4 years down the line, if people are no longer unemployed, that's great. But what happens in those 4 years, right? So according to him, wages don't move in the downward direction. Let's first actually look at this. This is my normal equilibrium, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Yeah. Okay, here. This first graph represents my normal monetarist AS-AD framework, right? SRAS is meeting AD and it's meeting at a point on the LRAS, right? Because that's what it always comes back to. Now what happens on my curve on the right? Aggregate demand has increased. Yes? Aggregate demand has increased. We call this a positive output gap. This is actually your next topic. We call this a positive output gap. Why is there a positive output gap? Because there's a gap here, right? Between potential output and what my actual output is. Actual output over here is above potential output. So we can call that an inflationary gap or just a positive output gap. Why can we also call it an inflationary gap? Because it's also causing inflation, right? Price level is also higher. Am I going too fast? Are you all paying attention?
Can you go a little slow?
Yeah. Positive output gap and inflationary output gap because output is higher and price level is also higher. Yes? Okay. But now what is the theory? That things are going to come back to equilibrium. So basically, aggregate demand increased. What happened when aggregate demand increased? Economic growth occurred. Yes. And inflation occurred. Now that inflation occurred, remember we learned the price wage spiral? Dhruvi, what's the price wage spiral?
I'm not sure like how to define it, but when due to economic growth, like the workers, they demand for higher wages, which leads to like further inflation due to inflation.
Yeah. So because there's inflation, they say that their cost of living has increased. So they deserve to be paid more, right? So if they deserve to be paid more, can we say the cost will again increase? Cost of production, again causing cost push inflation. Plus people will have higher income so they can buy more goods and services. So demand pull inflation. Yes. So because inflation occurred and increased the cost of living, workers pressed for wage rises, which further increased my cost of production. Right? So now when my cost of production increased, can we see how over here my SRAS shifts to the left? If my cost of production increases, my SRAS shifts to the left. So I was at this point, aggregate demand increased, so I was at this point, but because of the inflationary expectations, I come back to this point. Inflation occurred, so more inflation occurred. But at the same time, can we see how the output gap was given up? How the output gap got fixed? Does this make sense? No? You guys look really blank. Sorry?
Could you please explain that again?
Yeah. Okay. So do you follow these first two graphs? Actually?
Yeah, it's about the positive output gap, right? Oh, the
Yeah,
inflation.
aggregate demand is increased, and so there's a positive output gap. There's economic growth and inflation. That's it. Yes? We follow this. Now, because there's inflation, workers say that, hey, my cost of living has increased. I deserve to be paid a higher wage. Make sense? I deserve to be paid a higher wage. But now if you pay them a higher wage, wouldn't that increase your cost of production? When my cost of production rises, my SRAS shifts to the left. My aggregate supply reduces if my cost of production increases. And so you reach back to this LRAS point. You started here, aggregate demand increased, so you ended up in this positive output gap. But because people now were expecting inflation, so wages increased, your cost of production also increased. And so you came back, your SRAS shifted back. So you ended up again on this line. That's what defines this line. That's the monetarist idea, that you'll always come back to this level of output. Okay? Dhruvi, is that clear? You'll always come back to that level of output. Same thing we can see when aggregate demand falls. Aggregate demand fell, it caused a recession. Can we say this is a negative output gap? Right? There's a negative output gap that's taken place, right? And my price level is also decreased in this scenario. Now, according to monetarist theory, if aggregate demand has fallen, people are going to be willing to accept lower prices for resources. Okay? Resource prices will fall. Like people will be willing to work at lower wages, right? If better, because there's some unemployment over here. If there's a negative output gap, if output is less, if output reduces, of course it creates some unemployment. When there's unemployment, can we say that wages tend to reduce? When there's unemployment, wages reduced. And so my cost of production increases. Make sense? Wages reduced. So cost of production increases, falls. And so my SRAS shifts to the right. Look over here. Recession, my negative output gap, led to unemployment. So people will be willing to accept lower wages. So my cost of production fell and my SRAS shifted to the right. Make sense? We were at this point and we reached this point, but SRAS shifted to the right. And so we're back on a potential output level. Okay? Back to a level of potential output. So what actually happened is in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were just following this idea that we keep coming back to this level of output. And then what happened is the Great Depression occurred, where for like years and years, people were stuck in that phase of unemployment. And there was very, very high unemployment. And so that's when Keynes came in and he said that this works. Your theory is correct. Your theory works when there is a positive output gap. People will increase their wages, more inflation will occur, and output will come back. But he said that the same does not apply when you talk about wages for reducing. That how much ever unemployment of resources there is, wages will not fall. At least not quickly enough. Okay? He said wages don't move downwards, so your SRAS won't increase and you won't reach back to that level. You'll be stuck in that recession. Okay? Now, why may wages not fall? Employment contracts, trade union power, national minimum wages, and because they just overall have a demotivating effect. Firms also don't want to reduce wages because people won't be happy working anymore. Yeah? So for all of these reasons, according to him, wages won't decrease. And so your economy will get stuck in a recession. So generally, the basic idea that differentiates the two schools of thoughts is that the new classical thought believes that we reach the full employment level on its own. Therefore, there should be no government intervention. Milton Friedman was the biggest supporter of free market economics. Okay? That there should be zero government intervention. He believed even defense should be privatized. Whereas Keynes said that you will get stuck in a recession, and that's why we need to have government intervention. And that's when we started having things like fiscal policies. Make sense? Gives you a little understanding of how eco works. No? Dhruvi, you look really confused.
No, I understood.
Okay. And do we understand now also why this curve is shaped the way it is? This curve is shaped the way it is based on the same inflexibility and spare capacity idea, okay? So the first section of this curve shows you that my LRAS is perfectly elastic. Why is it perfectly elastic? Because we're producing at very low real GDP, right? So can we say a lot of my resources are going to be unemployed? When there is high unemployment of resources, I don't need to actually reduce the wages of my resources, don't need to actually increase wages of labor to attract them to work. People are going to be willing to work. Prices of my resources won't bid up, okay? There's a lot of spare capacity. So your resources will be available at whatever price they should be available at. But eventually what happens is that resources start to get more used up as we start having a higher level of GDP. My potential output hasn't changed. Quantity and quality of resources hasn't changed here. Assuming the same quantity and quality of resources, we are saying that more are getting used up. So as more and more resources get used up, you might have to start paying workers more to attract them, paying suppliers more to be able to get access to some resources. Yes? So that's why your price level is starting to rise. So your curve moves upwards. And then eventually you reach your resource bottleneck. The vertical part of LRAS represents, of course, that you can't produce any more. You have reached your productive capacity. So that means all my resources are employed. Can we say it's going to be the full employment level? If all my resources are employed, I'm just going to have to steal through these workers, steal Ashna supplies. So I'm just going to have to pay them more than you are. Yeah? So a lot more inflation will occur. Okay? Lot more inflation will occur. Wait. Yeah. So this is long run macroeconomic equilibrium. When we move from AD to AD1, there's no inflation because your economy has a great degree of spare capacity. But when we move from AD1 to AD2, there is inflationary growth, right? There is inflationary growth because you no longer have that much spare capacity. So can we say that economic growth and price stability are conflicting each other? We always said that, right? When we've done conflicts of macroeconomic aims at IGCSE, we've always said that economic growth conflicts price stability. Economic growth leads to inflation. Now, do we understand exactly why? How we can use this graph for analysis? This is a question that still comes. Talk about two macroeconomic aims and how they complement or conflict each other. Yeah? All right. Then I said that your LRAS can also move outwards. When will your LRAS move outwards? LRAS represents productive capacity. So it will move out whenever your PPC can move outwards, right? When your quantity and quality of resources change, that's when your LRAS can shift. When my productive capacity itself changes. Yes? Labor force increases, discover new resources, advances in technology, labor productivity rises. This is how it will move for monetarist. This is how it will move for Keynesian. This is a very interesting graph for Keynesian. First, I was at income level Y, right? AD intersected my LRAS and I was at income level Y. Typically now when I would have shifted from AD to AD1, I would have ended up here with economic growth, but also inflation. But because my LRAS has shifted outside, I end up having no inflation. Yes? I end up having no inflation. So can we say that an increase in LRAS allows for non-inflationary economic growth? An increase in LRAS allows for non-inflationary economic growth. Sounds good? This time no inflation occurred, right? Price didn't change. Price level remained the same over here. Aggregate demand intersected my new LRAS curve, right? So this is why we started having supply side policies. We understood why we started having monetary and fiscal policies to change my aggregate demand so that my economy doesn't get stuck in a recession. I want my aggregate demand to move back outside because I don't believe that my SRAS is going to shift. I don't believe that my SRAS is going to fall. My resources prices are not going to fall. That's why I need to increase my aggregate demand. So I have fiscal policies and monetary policies. But then what happened in the 1970s? So in the 1910s, the Great Depression happened, and that's why we shifted to intervening, having fiscal monetary policies. Then in the 1970s, Saudi Arabia increased its oil prices. Okay. Saudi Arabia decided to increase its oil prices. So this time, for the first time, the supply shifted to the left. All of Keynes' policies would lead to changes in aggregate demand. If aggregate demand increases, I end up with higher prices. So that's a problem. Or if aggregate demand falls, I end up with lower economic growth. That's a problem. This time, if I have high prices and low economic growth, I can't sacrifice either, right? If I make expansionary policies, my price level will get much worse. And if I use contractionary policies, my income and output and employment level will get much worse. So what do I do? And this is when we started using supply side economics. Okay. This study is called stagflation, this scenario. Earlier, what did we have? Positive output gap is inflation. Negative output gap is deflation or recession. It's also caused a deflationary output gap or a recessionary output gap. Okay. Negative output gap, deflationary output gap, recessionary output gap, whatever you want to call it. This is called stagflation because there is stagnation, meaning low output, and there is also inflation. You're messed up from both sides. That's why we started using supply side policies to change my aggregate supply in order to have non-inflationary economic growth. Okay. Decent revision. This is AS. This is what I just taught AS. But we weren't really taught it properly at school. So going back, this is where we were, right? Going back, environmental actual versus potential economic growth. Now this should be simple. One distinction to make is actual is also just considered short run aggregate economic growth, and potential is considered long run economic growth. Okay. So actual economic growth is when there's an increase in real GDP, and potential economic growth is when there's an increase in productive capacity. So now, based on the graphs we have learned, I need you guys to tell me all the ways that we could represent this.
Will we use the PPC for potential?
We can use the PPC for actual also, right? First, let's do PPC. How will I represent actual economic growth on my PPC?
Moving from point inside to the point on the PPC.
Perfect. It doesn't have to be on, it just has to be towards, right?
Yeah.
Could we draw these?
Yeah. Why not? So what is
So
actually
can you scroll a little up? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Any movement towards the curve is going to represent actual economic growth, because it's showing you that there's actually an increase in output, right? In the amount of consumer goods produced and capital goods produced. And how are we going to see potential economic growth?
Shift in PPC.
Perfect. What kind of shift?
Outward.
Yeah. So an outward shift in PPC represents potential economic growth.
Can
Simple.
you explain the first diagram again?
First diagram. It's your
Like the first
PPC.
PPC.
It's your PPC.
Yeah,
What
but
does
why
a
is it
point in the
shifting?
PPC represent? What does
Like
a point in the PPC represent? A point in the PPC represents actual level of production, right? Your curve represents your quantity and quality of resources available in my economy. So what my economy could be producing, but a point represents what it's actually producing. Yes, point represents how much I actually end up making, how many of my resources are actually employed, right? So X represents a certain number of resources employed. I'm making 200 consumer goods, and at Y, I'm making 300 consumer goods. So my actual output is increased. Does that make sense?
So
Sorry?
why is what is expected, like why is the resources that are available, but like usually
No.
production happens inside. No,
Z is the resources that are available
yeah, sorry,
on
on
the
the
curve.
curve, yeah, it's the resources that are available, but like why is that much amount not produced?
Realistically, do you think that much amount can be produced? Can every worker in the economy be employed? Can every piece of land, every piece of capital be employed? No, right?
No.
If you drew this as Z also, there's absolutely nothing wrong. But then you have to remember and evaluate, okay, that you can't actually produce on your PPC. That would imply perfect productive efficiency. No, that's not going to happen. That one's for actual, this one's for potential. Okay, now let's consider actual economic growth on my Keynesian diagram.
Can you
And then,
just wait for 1 second? I'm just drawing.
yes. You need to scroll up.
Yeah, if possible.
So paper's turn 21st, right? Okay. And where have you reached in school, Dhruvi?
We are doing revision. We finished.
Okay. What is this one? Price level, right? So price level and real GDP. Ashna, how will I show actual economic growth on my Keynesian diagram?
I think moving towards a point that's on the towards like the top of the graph,
How am I going to move? What?
or like towards the right side.
No. So it'll be a change in my AD, right?
AD shift to the right. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. So it's going to be when my AD shifts to the right.
Does it have to be on the curve?
Oh, what do you mean?
No, like the
Like, are
right.
you asking like can it shift here?
Yeah.
No, it can't. It has to shift along the curve.
Or can it like be more up, like more upwards?
Yeah, it can be here also. Can be as up or as down. It could be like here and sorry. Like it could be here and here also, you know. But it has to be along the price level has increased and economic growth has occurred, output level has increased. Same thing, how would we show potential economic growth?
LRAS will shift to the right.
Thank you. How did that correct to that? We're going to have to draw aggregate demand because, I mean, to make our graph complete, but it has no relevance. Ultimately, we're just trying to show this shift. Okay. All right. We can also use the new classical graph. And I believe this one's not been given in your book.
These diagrams are not in the textbook, right?
No, the first four that we did are.
No, the one that you're doing now.
No, yeah, what I'm drawing now is not there. It's not there in this context. So this is my normal macroeconomic equilibrium. And I hope we all remember that Y represents income. And that's why we mark real GDP with Y. Remember YED, income elasticity of demand? Yeah, Y represents income in economics.
Does it represent like employment also?
Yes, because it represents output, it also represents income and employment. We will learn how all three are considered the same thing later in this chapter. So aggregate demand increases, yes. And this represents actual economic growth, because what's happening? I'm shifting from Y to Y1. And over here only, I'm going to let you know that this is also what we call a positive output gap or an inflationary output gap. What is an output gap? A gap between actual and potential output.
This is positive output gap for inflationary.
Or it's another name for it. Positive output gap or inflationary output gap is just a different name for it. Okay, so it's a gap between actual and potential output. So what is happening in a positive output gap? Actual output is above potential output, right? Actual output here is above potential output. Potential output is represented by what, guys?
Y1.
No.
The shift of the LRAS.
So the LRAS represents my potential output gap, no? My potential employment level. So I'm saying actual output is above potential output. What is going to be potential output? Potential output is measured by where my LRAS is. And what is my actual output,
Actual will be Y1,
Yes. And what is
where
Y1?
AD,
Yeah.
where AD cuts LRS.
Where AD1 intersects SRAS.
SRS.
Yes. Where my like normal like equilibrium is taking place. That's my actual output. Neonica, make sense?
Yeah, I just got confused between potential and actual.
Yeah.
For potential, we'll draw LRAS shift to the right, right?
No, you're not showing potential economic growth. You're just showing a positive
The
output.
other diagram I'm talking about for potential.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't have enough place here to do it very properly, but basically this.
So even SRAS and AD will shift.
Yes.
The equilibrium will be in the same line, right?
Yeah. There's no inflation really taking place. Like, I mean, this is all just an ideal scenario, right? I'm not saying like nobody's saying this is what always happens, but this is the ideal scenario. Okay, there's 3 more graphs. Do I show you actual and potential economic growth simultaneously first, or do I show you negative output gap first? We use both topics.
Are we not describing this graph?
Potential output increased. That's it.
So what will be the potential output in this?
What is my potential output represented by? What have we said? LRAS, right?
LRAS, sorry. And
So
the second
LRAS
one,
shifted to the right. Sorry?
will it be LRAS or LRAS1?
LRAS shifting to LRAS1 indicates that potential output has increased. Okay? So potential economic growth has occurred. That's what we were talking about. So potential economic growth has occurred. So this is what we want in the long run. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's first look at negative output gap. Neonica, you tell me, how will I show negative output gap?
One second, I'm just thinking.
Yeah. Look at your positive output gap and then tell me.
Will it be like AD curve shifting towards the left,
Perfect.
like down?
Is this under actual and potential growth only?
No, so that's what we skipped a little to output gaps. I didn't do it in a more, I didn't differentiate it properly enough. So the topic was actual and potential economic growth and then output gap and trade cycle. but it was the same graph, so I didn't want you guys to repeat it twice. Yeah, but we've explained it, so you shouldn't be confused.
Can you wait for a second?
Yeah, we'll explain this also. So what is there to explain here? What is a negative output gap? When a negative output gap is when potential output is more than actual output. Make sense? That's why my LRAS point is above is more than my Y, where AD1 meets SRAS, right?
Basically, potential output is always greater than the actual output, right?
No, we looked at our positive output gap. Actual output was greater than potential output, no?
Oh, right, I wrote wrong. I'm sorry.
Okay, so what do we call this? A negative output gap? Or a deflationary one? Or a recessionary one? Okay? Because we can see how there's a recession occurring because output is falling, and there's deflation occurring because price level is falling. Coming back to the idea of economic growth, we can also have simultaneous actual and potential economic growth, right? Sorry?
Can you go up for a minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, done.
Simultaneous potential and actual economic growth. So on the PPC, this is simple. Ashna, how will we represent it on the PPC?
I guess maybe that the PPC is shifting outwards
Yes, so that's potential.
and we shift a point on the PPC outwards towards the new PPC.
So it'll be like this.
Yeah.
Okay. So usually you don't need to ever draw those other two PPC curves. When you're drawing economic growth, stick to one PPC. Don't make three different PPC diagrams. Try to make your Keynesian diagram and your new classical diagram. It'll be higher level analysis. Yes?
In essay questions, these come as options, right?
Yes. Neonica, these are one of the easier options. It's tricky because we've just done it. Okay? Once you go through it, and once you see all the other content for economic growth in terms of cost of economic growth, causes of economic growth, it's very simple. All right? This is the only difficult part which was remaining for us. Don't worry. And this is also just difficult because our basics aren't clear. Okay, last graph, last concept for today that we already discussed, we'll just draw it, is when there's potential and actual economic growth on my Keynesian curve. So you have to draw this one a little carefully. All right. So what has happened here? Aggregate demand has shifted outwards. So actual economic growth has occurred, right? AD shift represents what? And LRAS shift represents what? Potential economic growth. So both have simultaneously occurred. And my whole point was that this is non-inflationary economic growth. So this also connects to your concept of non-economic growth. Why is it non-inflationary? Because can we see the blue dotted line? We avoided that level of inflation, right? Basically, my economy would not have had the spare capacity, right? I would have been close to full employment of my resources. That's why prices would have been bid up and there would have been a significant increase in the price level. But aggregate supply increased. My ability to produce more increased. Productive capacity rose. That's why this time when aggregate demand increased, I was able to increase my output level and employment level without any increase in prices. Dhruvi, can you remember the definition for demand pull inflation?
When the costs rise due to
Demand
an increase in aggregate demand. Prices.
an increase in the price level due to an increase in aggregate demand that cannot be met by an increase in aggregate supply. Remember? That's our definition for demand pull inflation. Because if aggregate demand increased and aggregate supply also increased, there would be no problem. That's what this graph illustrates. That's the definition we wrote in 9th and 10th also. And now we understand it in terms of aggregate demand increased, but even aggregate supply increased in line with it. That's why there was no inflation. Okay? Take a minute and go through everything you've written. Go through all the graphs you've made. Please double check if you've written it correctly. In fact, send me a photo of this last one.
Can you re-explain why have you drawn the blue dotted line?
Yes. So if there was no new LRAS, where would my intersection point have been? First, we started here and aggregate demand increased. So wouldn't my intersection point have been here? Correct?
Yeah.
That's where AD would have met AS. So there would have been economic growth, but there would have also been a very high level of inflation. Yes?
Because price rise.
Because there's a supply bottleneck, right?
Oh, right.
I'm operating very close to my full employment level. The vertical area of my LRAS represents what? Full employment, right? That there is no more spare capacity, that we have reached my potential. So if we are reaching the potential of economic growth, if I don't have any more unemployed resources, I'm going to have to pay a lot to attract workers, to be able to buy some resources. That's why this time when we try to increase our output, we end up causing a lot of inflation. Okay? But because my LRAS shifted outwards, because my quantity and quality of resources improved, there was no longer a very high level of employment, right? There was now some spare capacity. There was some room for me to be able to grow. That's why this time aggregate demand intersected over here and didn't end up causing any inflation. Make sense?
Yeah, a little. I'm getting a little confused.
Okay. Where are you getting stuck? Till where do you follow?
See, I understood that the AD, the AD thing shifts. That's why it's there, and then there is inflation at that point because there is less supply of resources.
Yeah. Do you also understand why my LRAS shifts outwards? LRAS shifts outwards when my productive capacity of my economy changes, right?
Yeah, because there's potential.
Potential economic growth. Same reason
Yeah.
my PPC curve shifts outside, my LRAS shifts outside. Okay. So earlier prices were rising because there was lack of resources, right? Now there's no longer a lack of resources. quantity of resources has increased. You said prices were rising because there was not enough resources, right? There was a high employment of resources. So we were having to like fight over those resources, therefore increasing their prices.
Yeah.
Now we no longer have to fight over resources. We all can get whatever we want. So we don't have to pay extra for them. Make sense?
Yeah, all right. So that is like the like if there wouldn't have been potential growth, then like the blue dotted line is where the PL1 would have been expected to be, right?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
That's what our most normal graph is, right? I hope you guys need to draw the normal graph. Our normal Keynesian graph is what? I have my LRAS. AD, AD1, AD2. I should have started with this, but I thought we know this. Move from Y to Y1 to Y2, right? Economic growth is occurring, but at the same time, my price level also ends up increasing. First time my price level doesn't increase really because we are at a high level of spare capacity. But later, as my resources are more and more employed, my price level increases more because we're fighting over those resources. Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
YZ will be the full employment level, right?
Y2, yes.
Yeah, Y2, sorry.
Yes, yes. That's the full employment level.